What's going on, everybody? Mortem here. Today we are talking my recap and a bunch of other information about the last Azlanti competition that I just recently wrapped up. Now, this was a competition for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous held by its developer, Owlcat Games. Just to give some background to how this challenge kind of started, basically just trying to answer any questions people might have. So, before the game even launched, actually, one of the company's CMs reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in this competition. I said, yeah, sounds like a lot of fun. Didn't hear anything for a while after the game had launched. They, of course, sent me my launch review copy, which I, of course, used to make a bunch of content. And then afterwards, they got a hold of me probably a couple weeks after launch and were like, hey, we're going to be going ahead with this competition. We were just waiting a while to get all the initial launch problem solved and any reports they had, especially on the acts that went untested in the beta period. And then they gave me the official start date, the rules and everything. And then, of course, we kicked it off on this channel on 22nd, which was a few days past the actual start time. I think the actual start date was the 20th of September, if I remember correctly. But if you're unaware of the rules of the challenge, I'll also go over those real quick. Basically, Last Azlanti mode for these games is an Iron Man mode, where if your main character or a plot-crucial character dies, you get a game over screen, and that game over screen wipes all of your saves for that playthrough. Now, you can't save manually. The game will save when you exit the game, and sometimes it'll make a few extra saves, so you have a little bit of wiggle room so long as you don't die. But once you die, it will wipe everything you've got. In addition to Last Azlanti mode, we had to use the companions. There were no mercenaries allowed, there were no respecs allowed, and there were no reloads allowed. So if you're unaware, in Last Azlanti mode, even though it's an Iron Man mode, you can reload back to the previous save you've made whenever you've exited the game last, or just, forced to save by exiting. You can just load those anytime. So Last Azlanti mode does actually allow a certain amount of reloading, but that wasn't allowed for the competition, of course, as it wasn't really in the spirit of the competition, as you might imagine. The guidelines for the challenge and the win conditions, if you will, were basically of the 24 streamers participating over a period of 6 weeks, which at the time of this video is still going on. There's actually about 2 weeks left, but we're finished, so we're going to talk about what we know here. But over the course of 6 weeks, the goal was to get as far as you can in Last Azlanti mode, with the win conditions, of course, being as far as you can get in the game compared to everyone else. And then, if there is a tie, or basically people complete the game, whoever completes the most quests would be the tiebreaker after that. And then if they've completed the same amount of quests, the third tiebreaker is the time it takes to complete the challenge. So while I did complete my run, I beat the entire game on normal difficulty as part of the rules as well, forgot to mention that. While I did beat the game, currently I am in 4th place. That may or may not change a little bit as people wrap up the last 2 weeks of the competition. I'm honestly not sure. But currently 4th place. And that is because while I beat the game, the 3 people ahead of me were able to complete more quests than I did. Now, realistically, if I had done every quest available to me in the final stream I did for the game, because, of course, the competition also had to be live streamed in its entirety, but if I had done every quest available, I could have pushed ahead to 3rd place. However, that would have been a giant headache, so in the end, I decided to just play it safe, head for the end of the game, and complete the challenge. And that's kind of the more initial stuff out of the way. So the rest of this video, I kind of want to talk about some of the builds and things I use, talk about some of my decisions, as well as just some general stuff. So first things first, my main character for this competition was a blood kineticist, specifically using my Blood Weaver build with some slight alterations. So this is a video I've posted previously if you're interested. However, one of the main differences that I took between this competition and that video is the fact that I used a human instead of a kitsune. Personally, the Blood Weaver build was meant to be fun, which is why I picked a kitsune for that build. However, for this competition, we min-maxed a little bit and chose a human, specifically so I could get more feats, because humans get an extra feat at character creation. And because I knew ahead of time that we were going to be picking a Zada, which gets a superpower called Life Bonding Friendship that allows you to share your teamwork feats with your entire team by only taking them with one character, our main character. Thus, having more feats opens up a little bit more flexibility with what I could do feat-wise. Now, why a blood kineticist, however? To put it pretty simply, I figured nobody else in the competition was likely to use a kineticist because they are a class that a lot of people tend to shy away from. I personally, however, love kineticists, one of my favorite classes. Blood kineticist specifically, I love because of their ability called Rack more than anything else. This is an ability that is basically a guaranteed hit on anything that has blood, basically. Now, some enemies are immune to it. The undead, swarm enemies, elementals, that type of stuff. Basically anything without a circulatory system would be a nice way to think about it, outside of like swarms, you know. Some enemies are immune to rack, however most of them are not. And what rack does is for basically half damage or a quarter damage on a fortitude save, rack will be a guaranteed hit if it's not hitting something that it's immune to it. But otherwise, it's a guaranteed hit for basically half damage, which doesn't sound that great until you realize that kineticists in-game can easily do 600-700 damage every turn. So half of that is a guaranteed 300 damage. And again, there is no attack roll for rack, it just hits. As long as the target isn't immune to it, it hits, period. So that's really why we chose Blood Kineticist. That said, I use Blood Kineticist on core and below. Higher difficulties, I actually like to use the Elemental Engine archetype instead, and that is purely because on higher difficulties, the enemies actually have like double health, which means doing reduced damage through rack isn't super effective. So on those difficulties, it's usually better to go with the Elemental Engine, which gets a bunch of offensive buffs, plus I can focus on a specific energy blast that will hit range touch AC and is more likely to do full damage hitting a lower AC. Now truthfully, the builds for the rest of the team were pretty basic outside of a couple instances. Because it was normal mode and I didn't need to do anything too crazy. We had Sela with us, kind of acting as our tank. Sela is, of course, the paladin companion that you get. We just made her a straight paladin. They get a bunch of great buffs that make your party immune to certain things, such as fear, in addition to great spells like Smite Evil or Mark of Justice, or class features, I should say. Moreover, paladins can actually also get an animal companion, which will help add to your action economy. But beyond that, we really just built Sela to be a tank and very hard to kill. And then we also had Camellia with us, so her I really only had in the party just out of habit more than anything else. Truth be told, I could have swapped her out with basically anybody else. She was very close to her auto build, to be honest. We made some slight variations, but very close to it. But her usefulness tends to fall off a bit late game. And again, honestly, we could have swapped her out with just about anybody. And honestly, might have been more effective even. And then we had Winduog. Some people like to use Laine instead of Winduog, as they tend to be mutually exclusive for most of the game. Personally, I like Winduog because I don't really like monks, and Laine is a monk. With Windu, she is normally a fighter, but while we can't change her initial first level in fighter, we took the rest of her 19 levels in Demon Slayer. This is because this way we could give Windu a pet animal companion, as well as the fact that the Demon Slayer Ranger archetype gets a bunch of bonuses to hit demons, which makes her as a physical attacker more useful throughout most of the game. And then we had Ninio with us as well. Now Ninio we were doing something pretty specific with, and that was focusing on her instant kill spells, Phantasmal Killer and Weird. Now in addition to this, we were also using her as a bit of a support caster to cast things like Haste, Heroic Invocation, some of the mass buff spells like Bear's Endurance and Cat's Grace. But Ninio, through her spells Phantasmal Killer and Weird, can potentially just one-shot kill any enemy that isn't immune to mind-affecting spells. And as people saw throughout the playthrough, that can be very effective. Towards the end of the game, Ninio is clearing entire rooms with just one spell cast of Weird, which is an AoE Phantasmal Killer, which if the target fails 2 saves, just flat out dies. Now because of the items available in the game, we were able to buff up her spell DC to a point where enemies, short of rolling a nat 20, would most of the time just die. And we used that basically through the entire playthrough. It was a lot of fun. And then last in our party we had Ember. Ember, I was using my Cauterizing Flame build for her. Now some people like to give her levels in Arcane Trickster to give her some of the benefits that that archetype gets for ray attack spells. However, we went with her regular Stigmatized Witch archetype. However, we focused on gear and things that were going to give her as much damage with her ray attacks as possible. Because Ember, just on leveling up her regular archetype, gets a ton of fire spells. And then with her regular level ups, and spell choices we could then pick a bunch of cure spells. So she can simultaneously be our healer as well as a ridiculous blaster caster. In fact, there was one point in the competition where we one-shot an in-game boss with Ember because she rolled like 800 damage on a Hellfire Ray. Now, there are tons of improvements you could make to your party comp here. However, given that we couldn't use mercenaries and I couldn't respec anybody, this is kind of what I just felt the most comfortable with playing because it's what I play with a lot. However, yes, there are tons of optimizations I would like to make on core difficulty, or, just higher difficulties than normal, basically. So with party comp out of the way, I kind of want to talk about a couple other things. Overall, I had a ton of fun with this competition. I really enjoyed it. It was fun doing something in an official capacity for the game that wasn't just like making guides and stuff. And honestly, just interacting with the stream and everything was a lot of fun for me personally. Plus, getting to update everybody on all of the participants and things as Alcat posted leaderboards was just fun for me. That said, I will mention a few things. So, while the total quest as a tiebreaker isn't a huge deal, like honestly, even if I'd done everything, it still would have been a loss, and I knew going into it that the quests were the tiebreaker. So at the end of the day, that's on me, because I failed 3 quests because I wasn't paying attention, and then I actually forgot to pick up 2. At the end of the day, that's nobody's fault but mine. That said, as a tiebreaker, I don't know that I necessarily enjoy quests being the tiebreaker, because there's a slight variance in the amount of quests available depending on the mythic path you take. So while for the most part, it's about as fair as you could probably get for a competition like this, there's just that kind of bit of nuance to it that makes it a little bit frustrating. But in terms of time spent in the campaign, of the people who have completed the game, I was the fastest by a mile. I have probably a good 25 hours, I believe, on the next closest person. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about here was the difficulty of the competition. A lot of people have expressed interest in seeing a competition like this for core difficulty rather than normal. A lot of people felt that normal difficulty was too easy. I both agree and disagree. So what I mean by that is that for this competition, I think normal was the appropriate choice. And that is because this particular competition had a lot of participants that hadn't had a ton of experience with Pathfinder games. Some of them were streamers who had actually never played at all, and a couple of them were people who were familiar with the game but hadn't actually got a chance to play through the whole thing. And while I think normal difficulty is fair enough for a competition that involves those people, core would have been a mess for those people. Because for someone who isn't aware of how Pathfinder works, I would be surprised if a lot of those people got out of Act 1. Which wouldn't even be their fault, there's just a lot to learn about Pathfinder. So if they're going to do a competition on core difficulty, Last Azlanti, like that, I think the people involved in the competition would need to be either content creators or people that had a ton of experience with the game, like maybe establish some sort of minimum requirement experience or something, or like maybe a mandatory playthrough completion for somebody or something like that, which would be a hard thing to prove, but you kind of get my point. Just some sort of minimum standard so you know that the competition isn't going to be literally unfair to the person who hasn't played the game, you know what I mean? And yeah, you could make the case that like that person knew that they hadn't played it going into it, but still, that's not a fun experience for anyone, I imagine. All of that said, I wanted to talk a little bit about just kind of some general thoughts about it. Now, even on normal mode, I think there are definitely fights where if you just get unlucky and things don't get your way, you can absolutely still lose. We had a couple close calls in the competition myself, and I play this game all the time. In fact, generally speaking, the start of Act 3 tends to be the worst part of the game for me, progression-wise, because they basically open up the entire map and they give you all of the main quest threads all at the same time. And the problem with this is your character is, typically speaking, around level 9 or 10 right here. And depending on how you choose to tackle those things, it can be a real problem for you. And it feels to me like there's a bit of a balance issue right at the start of Act 3. It tends to balance out, it's not impossible by any means, but the start of Act 3, in my opinion, is the roughest part of the game balance-wise. Because after that, it gets a lot better. And basically any order after like the first few hours of Act 3, everything's pretty much good to go. You can tackle it, you'll probably be fine. If you lost, you can either, come back at a higher level, or you just need to redo your spells or your approach. But the start of Act 3, it's very possible to do things in an order, even accidentally, where you're under-leveled for something and you just don't really know what to start with because it doesn't tell you what level recommendation or something for the quest. So the start of Act 3 is always a little rocky in my opinion, because in just normal mode, we almost died to the ancient treant that I forgot was in Wintersun at the start of Act 3. We almost died to the dragon, not necessarily because we did anything wrong, but because we failed a check and I couldn't reload due to the rules of the competition, which, while a bit of a mess, was still really fun, so, it worked out. Beyond that, I did want to mention the only other thing I really don't like balance-wise is in Act 5 and the start of Act 6. There are 2 mobs that you can run into, but technically is 1 mob, but there's 2 of them, called the Vivakia Vanguard. These things are ridiculous. If you're unaware, for starters, some mythic monsters late game get 2 lives. You'll kill them, they'll fall down, they'll get back up. Usually you can always tell which ones these are because they are covered in purple crystals, which are relevant to the plot. The Vivvin Vanguard are one such enemies. In addition to that, they also have the highest base AC, if I'm not mistaken, of any enemy on normal, of like 75. So right there, just hard to hit. So you need to hit touch AC, which is fine. But the other thing is, the Vivvin Vanguards have a fear effect that I believe is bugged, but it will penetrate fear immunity. I don't think it's supposed to, I think it just does. So if they hit your characters with this fear, they are basically permanently feared for the rest of the fight, at which point you have to just hope your character gets far enough away from the Vanguard to give you their turn, at which point you have to take actions without getting too close to the Vanguard to trigger the fear run away. And it's just a nightmare of an experience on both of those fights. People have asked me this before, but what do I think is the toughest fight in the game is not actually any of the optional bosses, which are tougher than most of the regular enemies as well, but it is actually the fight right at the start of Act 6 with the second Vivvin Vanguard. Because in addition to the Vanguard, it has a ton of demons with it, who are also strong in their own right, but being with this Vanguard that just has a fear that cuts through your fear immunity makes it an insanely difficult fight, even on normal. I hate that fight. And honestly, if the fear piercing your fear immunities wasn't a thing, that fight would be a joke. Or at least much easier, I should say. Now that said, outside of those specific pain points, the rest of the competition went really well. There were a couple of mistakes made, obviously, like the quests we failed because I was being forgetful. We accidentally failed a couple checks, which made a few things harder than they needed to be. But for me personally, the start of Act 3 being a little rocky balance-wise, and then those 2 Vanguards late game are easily the pain points of the entirety of the game for me. So beyond that, though, honestly, a really smooth run, no complaints otherwise. Most of our plans worked out, outside of a few failed skill checks here and there. But even those, we were able to secure the win. I had a plan going into it with our build and everything. So overall, just a smooth run. So if you tuned in for any of the streams, truly just honestly, thank you for showing up. Thank you for watching this video. If you made it this far, it's a bit of a long one. More than anything, though, I just had a ton of fun with this. Kind of wanted to share my thoughts on the whole competition as much as I could, so I decided to make this video as a bit of a recap, sort of a monologue essay type thing. Truly, just thank you guys so much for watching, your support during the streams, your continued support watching videos. Cannot thank you guys enough. Everyone watching this and hearing these words, y'all are the reason I do this, am able to do this, so truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.